Our principal thoughts belong to God, not to the world. Let us hold the profession of our faith without wavering. What will I do? I will fear no evil, for thou art with me.
All right, well, good morning to everybody. If you're a visitor here, we're glad to have you. Got a couple of my former students came in, surprised me today. And that has been, as I've gotten older, one of the great thrills of that job, seeing people get married, have families of their own, and out doing their own thing and living their own lives, and then in some cases I've even taught their kids, and that's even more interesting. I told one girl at a parent conference that I taught her, and I had her daughter, and we didn't talk about the daughter at all. I wanted to talk about was one time she got in a fight right outside my classroom door, and I said, "Do you remember that?" And she said, "Yes, Mr. Hood, I remember that. We don't have to talk about it." So that's an interesting perspective now. But we're glad that you're here today. And today I'm going to do something that I haven't done often since I've been here, is I'm going to the Old Testament today. The Old Testament. And I'm not going to tell you where yet. I want to build a little suspense here and let you think about it and see if you might can figure it out, you might not. But I think all of us would admit that we do read more out of the New Testament than the Old Testament. I know I do. And we certainly preach and teach more here out of the New Testament. In the New Testament, we have the Gospels, that tell us about the life of Jesus and the message that He taught here on earth. We see the birth of the church in Acts. And then we have instructional letters that we like to read and dissect and understand. And we even have a revelation of John that tells us about the end. But we must not forget the Old Testament, because it really is one of the reasons that we believe in the New Testament. We believe the New Testament because of the Old Testament. And why is that? It's not just a collection of Jewish stories and myths, as some claim, but the Old Testament is about Jesus, the Messiah. It all points to Him. And this is what Ryan and I talked about when he started doing the teenage class. I told him, I want to make sure they understand the Old Testament and how it points to Jesus. It points to the Christ. And we know that there are written prophecies about the Messiah in the Old Testament. Isaiah 53, probably the most famous. And see, that's written 700 years before the birth of Christ. 700 years. And that passage perfectly describes Jesus in the Gospels, doesn't it? We know Zechariah wrote about Jesus going into Jerusalem on a donkey. And that was fulfilled, wasn't it? And that's just two examples by two different authors at two different time periods. They didn't consult with one another to get their story straight. You see, in the Gospels are that way too. Jesus perfectly fulfills all of that. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they didn't all sit down at a table together. Okay, let's make sure we got the story right so people believe this and make sure it all works out. See, that would be impossible to plan. Impossible. Somebody would make a mistake at some point. And so we know there are written prophecies in the Old Testament, but the Old Testament is full of what we could simply call picture prophecies or types of Christ that we see. And what I mean by that is we can look at events in the Old Testament. We can see objects in the Old Testament. We can even see people in the Old Testament that foreshadow the coming Messiah. And if you don't know what that means, what to foreshadow means, it's a literary device. When you read a book, a story, we'll put it as a narrative. When you read a story, throughout that story, the author gives you hints and clues as to what may happen later in the story. Maybe it's about the ending, maybe it's about the climax or something like that. But he gives you little hints along the way. But you don't know that they're hints as you are reading it. You don't know it until you finish the story. And then once you finish the story, you can look back and say, well, he was telling us what was going to happen. He was giving us clues about it all along. I just couldn't see it until after I'd read the story. That's the Old Testament. It points to Jesus. And we know that it does. We can read the Old Testament, and then when we get to the New Testament, there's Jesus. And we can look back at all of the clues, all of the written prophecies, all of the pictures that point to Him. So that's what foreshadowing is, and that's what the Old Testament is. And that's the way you need to read the Old Testament, with that in mind each time that you read it. But here's some objects and events in the Old Testament that foreshadow the coming Christ, just to go through some briefly. The Passover, the sacrificial lamb of the Passover. The only people that were saved were the ones that had the blood of the lamb on the doorpost. The bronze serpent that Moses lifted up in the wilderness. The Gospel of John explains what that is a picture of. Because Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, the Son of Man must also be lifted up. Manna from heaven. Jesus came down from heaven, and He is the bread of life. The ark of safety from God's judgment. Jesus is that ark of safety. Office of the high priest. Jesus is our eternal high priest, mediator between God and man. The rock in the wilderness and the water saved the people. Paul said, I believe it's in 1 Corinthians, that Jesus is that rock. Jonah in the belly of the fish for 3 days foreshadows Jesus being in the belly of the earth for 3 days. And He came out, just as Jonah did. And of course, we have people in the Old Testament who are pictures of the coming Christ. Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice, and he died for it. Noah, of course. Noah, the only reason Noah's family was saved was because of him. Just as the only reason we're saved is because of Jesus. Melchizedek, the mysterious character in the Old Testament, he was a priest and a king, and the Jews revered him. But yet he wasn't a Levite. In fact, Levi hadn't even been born at the time of Melchizedek. Isaac, the sacrificial son. Moses, deliverer and mediator. Joshua, the conqueror who gives rest. And as we say in the New Testament, we look forward to that rest through Jesus when He comes back and conquers evil. David, the shepherd king. And of course, Jonah, that I already mentioned. But there is another that I didn't mention in that list that I want to talk about, at least for 2 weeks. This time, and I'll have to look at the schedule. I think it's in a couple of weeks when I'll be back with you. But I want to look at the life of Joseph. I want to look at Joseph, the suffering servant. The suffering servant. And as Tracy read the scriptures this morning before Sunday school, it goes perfectly along with what I'm going to talk about. And then Dad tries to start talking about what I'm going to talk about too. So I guess you're going to get a triple, not a double portion, a triple portion of the same thing. But Joseph, the suffering servant, I want to look at his life. It's a long story, so I had to divide it up into 2 parts. And I also want to look at his life, how it's a picture of the future Messiah. But we won't get into that part this time. I'll have to save that for next time. And so let's go to Genesis 37. Genesis chapter 37. And while you're flipping there, Joseph, when I was growing up, back in the 1980s, the VHS tapes had come out, the VCRs. And we had this little VHS tape that it was a cartoon of Bible stories. And we used to watch that tape, and Joseph was on that tape. And it was always my favorite of those little cartoons, went through the story and everything. And I always liked Joseph. as a kid. That story always appealed to me for some reason. I think mainly because I share the same name with him. My first name is John. I don't go by Joseph. I was given the middle name Kurtz by my parents. But that is my first name. And then I gave it to my son and gave him the middle name Kurtz as well. So I can't say anything about that. But I always liked the story. And I'm speaking about this because of Caroline. Because she told me, I want you to talk about Joseph. This is several months ago. And I said, well, okay, I'll try to fit it in sometime. And so I finally got into it. When your daughter asks you to do something that kind of makes a little bit of difference in it. She has a little bit of pull, I guess you could say. So let's look at Genesis 37. Now, there's a lot of texts that go with this. So there'll be parts that I do skip around. And I gave Ryan a list of the scriptures that I wanted you to make sure you notice. And he'll put those up here as I go along. Hopefully he can figure out what was on that paper. So verse 1 says, Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. And we know Jacob's father was Abraham. And these are the generations of Jacob. Now here there's not a list of genealogy that's given like there are in some places. But what Moses is saying here, these are the generations of Jacob. He spends chapter 37 all the way through chapter 50 talking about the generations of Jacob and his sons. And so that goes all the way to the end of Genesis. And Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. And he was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. So he's only 17 at this point when we're introduced to him. And so he's probably supposed to be helping his brothers out there in keeping watch over everything, maybe learning from them as well. And he is reporting back, so Jacob may be wanting him to keep an eye on them, too. But Jacob had other wives besides Leah and Rachel, and I think we forget that sometimes. And these are two of them here. And the sons of these two women were Dan and Naphtali, were the sons of Bilhah. And Gad and Asher were the sons of Zilpah. And these were secondary wives of Jacob's, or concubines, as you could call them as well. And so going along here in verse 2, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now, no details are given here what, the bad report actually was or what they were doing. Maybe they weren't doing a good job with the flock. Or if you read chapter 38, a little story about Judah, if they were doing anything like that, it's pretty, they may have been pretty wicked. Well, they were wicked, as you can see from other places. But it doesn't give details. In verse 3, now Israel, which is Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. Or as the tradition of the King James, we're used to saying a coat of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph is Rachel's son, the beloved Rachel, the one that Jacob waited a long time to marry. And then she didn't have any time went on, she didn't have any children, but she finally does have two children. Joseph is the oldest, Benjamin is the other one. And so this boy is special to his father, even though he's the youngest. And his robe, this robe, expensive gift, no doubt, probably a sight to behold. This was usually reserved for the firstborn son, the heir, and the future leader of the family, who would get a double portion in the inheritance. And the oldest son was Reuben. And Reuben is not in the good graces of his father, Jacob. And I'll tell you why, if you don't remember, in just a second. We'll get to Reuben. But we can already see some parallels in the New Testament here with this robe of Joseph's. It reminds me of the parable of the prodigal son that Jesus told. Because the younger is the one that the father puts the robe on. After he comes back, he's repented, and the father puts the robe on him, the best ring. And these things were reserved for the older. And the older hated the younger for it in that parable. But see, that robe symbolized what in the story? Putting on Christ, the robe of righteousness. And we see that language, throughout the Bible, a robe of righteousness, or being clothed with righteousness, being clothed with Christ. And you see, Joseph is a righteous man. And he's the only one of his brothers that you could call righteous. Joseph. And his brothers hate him so much. Look at what the text says. They hate him so much that they can't speak to him in a civil way. They can't speak to him peacefully. And so they didn't try to conceal their hatred for him. They were just completely open about it. Which takes it even further, doesn't it? And then the next thing we see in the story of Joseph in 5 through 8 and 9 through 11 is he has two dreams. He has a couple of dreams. Now let's look at the first one in 5 through 8. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more, if that's possible. And he said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field," sheaves of grain, binding them together. "And behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brothers said to him, this is verse 8, and his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. So they hate him for the dreams and for the bad report, his words that he's bringing to Jacob. Now we know that this dream later comes true, doesn't it? We won't talk about that today, but it comes true during the famine when they go to Egypt. They bow before him, don't they? Because he saves them, and they bow. And it's possibly a messianic picture as well, right there. But let's look at dream number 2, in 9 through 11. "And then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. And so Jacob is smart enough to know, well, there might be something to this, because he knows the character of his son. And so this is how we're introduced to Joseph in the text. He's 17. He's the favorite son of the favorite wife of his father. His father trusts him and probably spoils him a little bit, if the truth were to be known. He has a new fancy wardrobe that he's sporting around in. He has a good life. So what more could a 17-year-old boy want than to be your father's favorite? How is Joseph a suffering servant? A suffering servant that is a picture of Christ. The suffering servant. That's what Isaiah 53 is about, isn't it? The suffering servant. So how is Joseph like that? He's not suffering. He has it made. Well, things are about to change, if you're familiar with the story. And so I won't read a lot of this text because it's long, so I'll summarize a lot of it as we go along. And so one day, after all of this, Jacob tells Joseph, he says, I want you to go and check on your brothers and to check on the flock. And so he does. Joseph obeys. They're off a good ways, and he finally finds them. And the brothers see him coming from way off. He would be completely noticeable in his coat of many colors, right? And so they can see, that's Joseph coming. And then here's what they say, and I've got that on the screen in verse 19. And they said one to another, Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. Wow, these are his brothers. Now, these pits that they're talking about, those pits were dug out to hold rainwater. That's what the pits that he's referring to. But there were no water in these pits at the time, we know, because they throw him in it eventually. And in the text says there was no water there. But that's what they were for. Now, let's get back to Reuben. And so the brothers say, well, let's kill him. Throw him into the pit. And then we'll just say that an animal's killed him and eat him up. And so Reuben objects to this. When you read the text, Reuben tells them, no, let's don't kill him. Let's don't shed his blood. Let's just throw him into one of the pits and basically just starve him to death. But don't kill him. And so that's what they do. They strip him down and throw him into one of the pits. And then once they do this, Reuben leaves the other brothers. He leaves. Doesn't say where he goes. It just says he's not there. You say, well, Reuben must be pretty noble. He wanted to save the brother. No. Reuben had an ulterior motive. Because, see, Reuben is not in the good graces of his father. And so Reuben's plan is, throw him in the pit, and then when everybody leaves, I'm going to come back and get Joseph out of the pit, take him back to Jacob, our father, and then my father will love me again because I have saved his favorite son. So that's his plan. That's why he didn't want to kill him. He said, well, why is Reuben in bad graces with his father? Well, to put this delicately as I can, Reuben had had sexual relations with Bilhah, one of Jacob's wives. You can read that back in chapter 35. That's why. And Jacob never forgets this. Because even in the end, when Jacob's dying on his deathbed, and all of his sons come in, he brings this up to Reuben. And because of this, Reuben loses his double portion inheritance because of this act. And the double portion is given to Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, in the end. And so Reuben thinks, wow, if I can save him, then maybe I'll get back in my father's good graces. Now, the reason that was so abhorrible was abhorrible any way you think about it, but that was a sign of him wanting to overthrow his father and taking the authority away from his father by doing that action. That's why it was so despicable. And so Reuben, he leaves. He plans to come back and get him out. And so the rest of the brothers sit down to eat. And as they're sitting there eating, they see a caravan of Ishmaelite traders headed to Egypt. And then Judah speaks up. And he says basically, why should we kill him? We can't, we don't get anything out of that if we kill him. What profit do we get out of killing him? He is our brother. I don't know how sincere he was about that, but he does say he is our brother. So let's not kill him. Let's sell him. Let's sell him to those guys. And then at least we'll get something out of it. And so that's what they do. They sell him for 20 shekels of silver. And Joseph is gone, seemingly, forever. He's sold into slavery for pieces of silver. Does that sound familiar? Being betrayed by your own? Well, we'll get into all that next time. Now, Reuben was not present when this happened. Remember, he left because his plan is to circle back around. So he doesn't know any of this has taken place. And then when he sneaks back to the pit to get Joseph out, Joseph is not there. And so Reuben thinks he's dead. And he rents his clothes because now he knows he's really not going to be in the graces of his father because he's participated in killing his son. And so Reuben returns to the rest of his brothers. They tell him what's happened. And then they slaughter a goat and dip the coat of many colors in the goat's blood. And they take that back to Jacob to tell him that Joseph is dead, devoured by a wild beast. Now, the irony in all of that is we know that Jacob was a deceiver in his younger days, wasn't he? He was a deceiver. And now he has been deceived by his sons. And so Joseph, he had a great life laid out before him, his father's favorite son, but now he's been sold into slavery. And so what's going through his mind at this point? He's 17 years old. Your whole future's laid out in front of you. You're 17, and now you're in a caravan to be a slave the rest of your life. So what's going through his head? His life's ruined. And that's how chapter 37 ends. And then in 38, we learn a little bit about Judah. I'm not going to go into 38. But if you want to see the character of Jacob's sons, read chapter 38. That story about Judah. Don't do it right now. You can do that later. But then the narrative of Joseph picks up again in 39. So if you want to flip over to 39, that's where we'll be. And so we learn that he ends up in Egypt as the servant of a man named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So he's an official, pretty prominent man here in chapter 38. But I want you to look at verse 2 of chapter 39. And look at what the first thing, and I've highlighted this on the screen so you'll notice it. Look what it says in verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. Now that statement alone would be worth the whole chapter. We could make a whole chapter just out of that statement, couldn't we? So God has not forgotten about Joseph. And Joseph has not forgotten about God either. So the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. In verse 3, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. And so a pagan realized this. A pagan. And he puts Joseph as overseer of all of his possessions. He puts him in charge of everything. His right-hand man. And then look at verse 5. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. And so 5 times in these first 5 verses of chapter 39, 5 separate times, there's some type of language that says the Lord was with Joseph, or the Lord blessed Joseph, or the Lord made Joseph succeed. And his master succeed because of him. 5 times in the first 5 verses. I think we need to pay attention to that, don't you? Because the author, I've told you that over and over again, repetition, that's also a literary device, that the author wants you to notice something. The Lord was with Joseph. So this might work out. He's been sold as a slave. But you know, if you got to be a slave, this is the kind of slave you'd want to be. If you had to be one, I guess. Rich man's house. He's put you over everything, all these responsibilities. But disaster happens, doesn't it? Now Joseph is a striking young man, apparently. And the worst thing that could possibly happen for a man in Joseph's position happens. Look at the end of verse 6. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." I think we know what that means. How many men have messed up their lives because of a woman? A lot. Prominent men. And you see, ladies, you know, here's the thing about men. If you don't know, they like attention from women. Don't they? I'm just being real here. Can we be real for a second? For some, it's like their kryptonite. A severe weakness. Samson is a good example of that. That was his kryptonite. I hate to use the comic book allusion, but I'm doing it. David had woman trouble. Didn't he? And in David's case, he lost that son over it. And so this is real. And men like attention from women. And women know this. It's the reality. But look how David responds at the end of verse 9. He's telling her, I'm skipping some of it, at the end of verse 9, he says, "You are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" That's his response to her. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. Now imagine what this man's going through. He's very young. He's a slave, but he's got a pretty nice gig. But no rice or anything. And this man's wife is trying to seduce him. Every day, day after day. He had to be nervous as a cat every day when he would go to the house, thinking, is this going to be discovered? What's going to happen to me? But look at verse 11. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Smart move by Joseph. When you can't do anything else, just run. Run. And he runs. I'm sure he was running better than Forrest Gump heading out of there. Run. But there's a valuable lesson there. Because I'm sure all of us would admit that at many times we flirt with all kinds of sins. It doesn't have to be this situation. But we flirt with all kinds of sins instead of running from it, like Joseph. We like to get as close as we can get without really jumping into it. We'll flirt with a lot of things. All of us could admit to that, I believe. If we're honest with ourselves, we'll do it. But we need to run from sin. That needs to be our practice, run from it. But we don't always do that. We don't always do that. If it's something that is a weakness of yours, you need to start looking at it with that mentality. Run from it. Run from it. Try not to put yourself in that situation. Run. Run. Now, that could be the rest of the sermon if I wanted it to be, but we'll keep going. So back to the narrative here. Something's left behind. Something's left behind. And it wasn't the coat of many colors this time. But it was a garment that belonged to Joseph, his outer garment. And however, this garment did not provoke mourning like the coat of many colors did. When that was left behind and taken to his father, that provoked mourning, sadness. This coat was left behind and it provoked anger from his master, not mourning. And so Potiphar's wife, she saw her chance to force her will upon Joseph. If he was not going to submit to her in a sinful manner, then she would falsely accuse him. And that's what she did. She accused Joseph of trying to force himself upon her. And so I guess the Me Too movement and the Believe All Women, No Matter What movement was around back then as well. Because the men believed her. The men believed her. And you know what happens because of that? Joseph is put in prison for a crime that he did not commit. he did everything perfectly here. He wouldn't listen to the woman. And then he ran at the end. But yet, he's in prison. And it's not looking good again for Joseph. A young man with no future. He gets sold as a slave, and that's bad enough. But, well, it's kind of not the worst situation. But now he's in prison. And this is an ancient prison. This is not like some of the prisons that we house our prisoners in America. This is in the ancient world. Have you ever been falsely accused of something? You ever been falsely accused of anything? If you have, you know how horrible that feeling is. The feeling of desperation in it. The feeling of, will people believe me? Or what are they going to think of me now? This kind of thing. That's what's going through his head. Sitting there in that prison. I didn't do anything. I tried to do the right thing. And now I'm sitting here in this prison. So you see, how is Joseph a suffering servant? Well, he's a slave. He's been sold by his own family. And now he's in a prison. And so this guy, he's a suffering servant. But look down to verse 21. And let's put that up here. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. And the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. And so 8 times in this chapter we have seen language like this, that the Lord is with Joseph, the Lord caused this, the Lord caused it to succeed. 8 different times. And these 23 verses. You say, well, how could the Lord be with somebody that's a slave and a prisoner? Well, what did we talk about already today? You say, is the Lord really with him? Well, see, that's why you need to know the whole story, isn't it? So let's continue a little bit. Now, we're not going to have time to finish the entirety of his life, and so this is pretty much where we're going to stop as far as the narrative of Joseph. But we believe that God has a plan. I had in my title up there, God, the sovereign God, is in time, on time, every time. And here was God's plan in all of this. While he's in the prison, he meets 2 men. Pharaoh had put these 2 guys in prison. Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker. Now, how you're a baker and get in prison, I don't know what the baker did to get in prison. It doesn't say, but I've always thought that was kind of humorous. Like, how do you get thrown in prison when you're a baker? But anyway, both of these men have a couple of dreams. And Joseph interprets both dreams. The cupbearer's dream has a favorable interpretation. The baker's, not so much when you read it. And eventually the cupbearer is restored to his old position. He gets his job back with Pharaoh. The baker, well, he ends up dead. Pharaoh kills him. Now, this shows you how God's plan starts to come together. Joseph tells this cupbearer, he gets his old job back. And he tells the cupbearer, when you get to Pharaoh, remember me. Put in a good word for Pharaoh, is what he's saying. Put in a good word for Pharaoh and maybe I can get out of here. But the cupbearer forgets about Joseph. And 2 more years pass. 2 more years. And now Joseph's about 30 years old. Since when we first were introduced to him. But then one day Pharaoh has a dream. and no one can interpret it. And then that cupbearer says, hey, I remember a guy in prison who interpreted my dream that I was going to come back here. It was favorable, and it happened. And so they get him out of prison. He interprets the dream. And then what happens? Joseph ends up being Pharaoh's right-hand man. His right-hand man in all the kingdom. And so see, the Lord was with Joseph. And that's where we're going to stop in the narrative, because we haven't even got to the brothers or anything like that. So we're going to stop right here. And for the rest of our time, we want to focus on this. You know, the Lord always has a plan. Joseph may not have seen it. And we may not can see it when it involves our own lives and the circumstances surrounding our own lives. You know, they may look bleak sometimes. They may be very bleak, just like Joseph. But you see, God is in control of everything. And see, that's what, you know, in Christianity, is, you know, myself and all of us have had to come to a conclusion of that when that are here, that if God is sovereign, that means He's in control of everything, and everything is everything. It's not 99% of it. It's all of it. And see, God knows what He's doing. It looked bleak. And it looks, why would He allow this to happen to Joseph? He was the only righteous one of the brothers. And he's a slave, and he's a prisoner. And they're still back with Dad. But God knows what He's doing. And see, in our situation, you know, He knows what we need. Even before we pray. Even before we ask for it. He knows what we need. You know, He took care of Joseph. And he's only 30 years old at this point. So this isn't all of the story. And He's taken care of him so far. And He will take care of His own. Because He knows who His sheep are. Doesn't He? If He's the good shepherd, shepherds take care of their sheep. They'll give their lives for their sheep, won't they? To protect it against danger. You know, and I got to thinking about this, and it reminded me of a song that we used to sing in my former church, and I think Mallory has even sung it here. And that's where I got the title for this from. It's a song by the Gold City Quartet. And I always liked the song. God is in time, on time, every time. The chorus goes like this. The song tells a narrative of Old Testament stories. Like Naaman, the leper, who goes to Elisha and tells him to dip in the Jordan 7 times. And he's healed of his leprosy. The 3 Hebrew children thrown in the flame. David and Goliath. And the chorus's refrain goes like this. God was in time when the children of Israel crossed the mighty Red Sea. And He was on time when the walls of Jericho fell at Joshua's feet. And every time that I feel discouraged and I wonder where He'll be, God's been in time, on time, every time for me. You know, and I think we have become afraid to say stuff like that. You know, in our circles, I think we're afraid to talk like that. To say that God's been in time, on time, every time for me. And you know why? Because of how prominent the prosperity gospel has become. Because of how prominent the name it and claim it, word of faith, charismatic doctrine has become. We're afraid to say stuff like that. But see, what we've got to remember is all of this stuff, you know, sow a seed and you'll be rich. Just give into my ministry and God's going to give you everything that you want. New house, new boat, new cars, whatever. Or if you need healing, just name it and claim it. Just speak the word, brother. Just keep speaking it and it'll come to pass. That's not in the Bible. And see, what we've got to realize is those people have hijacked the Word of God. They've hijacked it. And just because they have distorted the Word doesn't mean that we should be afraid to speak things that are true in fear of being labeled as one of them. Because that's true. I believe that God will be on time for us. You know, I don't know why some people go, it seems like, through more hardships than others. You know, I can't explain that. I'm not going to try to explain that. But it's just like, you know, some people, it's just one thing after another. It's just like bad things just happen to them all the time. And then this other person, it may seem like they're going through life pretty good all the time. I don't know why. But I know what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. If you want to turn over there, you can read. I'll read part of this. Matthew chapter 6. Now, if you've got a red letter Bible, these are red letters, aren't they? So these are the words of Jesus. And I either am going to worry about prosperity preachers and all of that, or I'm either going to take Jesus to mean what He said. And I'm going to choose the latter. But here in Matthew chapter 6, starting at verse 25, here's what Jesus said. I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, or what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or stow away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Are you not more valuable than birds? That's what He's saying. Then you skip down to verse 31. So do not be sorry, saying, what shall we eat? Or do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things. And your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But 33 is the catch. Here's the catch. And look what the first word is. But. A conjunction of contrast. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And man, isn't that the truth? Okay, so when we need things, when our circumstances are bad, these things that we need, we have clear references in the Bible that God will provide for us, just like He did Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. But you see, there's a catch here. And there's the catch. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. So you see, we've got to be humble. We've got to endure trials. We've got to be faithful. And faithful to God, faithful to the Word of God, faithful to each other, faithful to the church. Be in the Word. But you see, here's the problem with all of that. And this is common in the South, where everybody's a Christian. The Bible Belt, everybody's a Christian in the South. People only want to seek God when things are going bad. When they need God, they view Him as a glorified Santa Claus that's there to solve all of their problems, give them all, what they need. If I've got marital problems, well, now I need God. If I have financial problems, well, now I need God. Or if I've got problems with my kids, well, now I need God. 3 weeks ago, I didn't need Him because everything was going good then. But now I need God. And when things are going good, I don't have time for all of that. I don't have time to go to church. I got to go to travel ball. I've got to do X, Y, and Z. I don't have time for all that. I got to do my own thing until trouble hits. Being in a Pentecostal movement for a long, long time, this is probably more prominent there than anywhere because it is an experiential movement. And you know, once you're there a long time, you notice things like this. Now, we had a lot of faithful people because faithfulness was emphasized. And the majority were very faithful. But you see, every time we'd have a revival or something like that, there were always the ones that came in, something bad was going on in their lives. And they'll show up. You know, when I was a musician, I was always involved in the music program and things like that. And then over it for a long time. And so I was always on the stage. And I knew who these people were. And when I would see some walk in the back door, at the start of service, we're getting on the stage, we're already playing a song maybe. And I would tell myself, she's going to the altar today. Or he's going to the altar today. I could call it. Because I hadn't seen them in months, maybe a couple of years. And then when they show up, I said, yeah, they're going to the altar. And so sure enough, we'd be into the third or fourth song. And guess what? She goes down to the altar. And then, of course, people come around and start praying for them. And they feel better. Because there are people that are encouraging them. They're praying with them. And, there's emotion, tears a lot of times, and all of this. And so they start to feel good. And then they'll leave that day. And they'll come back for 2 or 3 weeks. Maybe a month. And then guess what? The marital problems got better. Or the financial situations got better. Or this situation's got better. I'm good. And so you don't see them. And then time will pass. The same person shows up again. I'm sitting on the stage. They're going to the altar today. And then guess what happens? They go down to the altar. And it's the same process over and over and over again. I've seen it, no telling how many times. I could call names if I wanted to. In fact, one of them, when I was clerk, I was the treasurer of the church, asked me, are our names still on the roll? Because we had purged the membership roll for people who hadn't been there in 40 years. And I said, no. And she said, well, why? And I said, you hadn't been here in over 10 years. Is God listening to those types of people? I don't think so. I'm not God, but I don't think so. You see, if we are really His, I believe He'll take care of us. I sincerely believe that. It may not be on our timing, but I think He'll take care of us. It may not be just what we want, but I think He'll take care of us. We may have to suffer a little bit, but I think He'll take care of us. But we have to honor Him in the good times and the bad times. And we have examples like Joseph to look at and to learn from. Have any of us been through something as bad as what he went through? I don't know all of your personal situations. Maybe, probably not, but maybe. And look how many times, it's not up there now, but look how many times that was in the Scripture. But the Lord was with Joseph. But the Lord was with Joseph. But the Lord was with Joseph. And we'll look at the rest of his life next time. And I'll mainly focus on how his life foreshadows the coming Messiah next time. But we always need encouragement. That's when we have each other. That's one part of coming to church, isn't it? Being with like-minded people. And we always need encouragement. And we can get that from the Word of God. We can also get that from each other. And this week, I'll just to be honest, I just didn't feel very spiritual this week. Do you know what I mean by that? I just didn't feel very spiritual. If you know what I mean. And I thought, I got to get up and talk in front of people about having faith in God and all of this. But I don't feel very spiritual this week myself. I was still reading the Bible, my daily thing. Obviously, I was preparing for this. But yesterday I sat down, it was raining outside. And you start going through the Word. You start dwelling on what it says. And there's encouragement there. There's joy there. It's real. And I wasn't depressed this week or anything like that. There's nothing like that. I just didn't feel spiritual. But yesterday when I sat down, there's nothing else you could do. It's pouring down rain. And I was going to study anyway, but it's not that. But it's just like it came alive to me in that moment. And just that encouragement was there. And you just feel something. Not to sound charismatic, but you just feel it. But that's only for the Christian. These people that I'm talking about, they just want God in the bad times. If you're not saved, you're not getting that from God. This is going to sound a little harsh. But if you're not a Christian, don't be asking God to help you out of jams. Because He's not listening to that. But if you're not a Christian, I want you to be. I can't will it. But I can tell you about Jesus, and I can tell you about this God that took care of Joseph. And if you'll put your faith and trust in Him, He'll take care of you too. But the greatest thing, and I'll close with this statement, the greatest thing that Joseph said, and we'll look at this next time, that's written in the account of his life, is when his family moved to Egypt. After everything had happened, everybody finds out who he is. Jacob, they move everybody to Egypt. His brothers are a little nervous because they think, well, we're going to be his slaves now because of what we did. And so they ask him for forgiveness of what they had done. And this is what Joseph said. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. And I love you all, and God bless you today.